Today, light from a dark psalm.
Welcome to Coffee with Creamer, where you get to sit down with our host, Dr. Barry Creamer, for a conversation about faith, life, and culture. We'll look at old ideas through a new lens, turn those culture wars on their head, and paint a picture of the way things could be. If you like your thinking deep and your coffee hot, pull up a chair. You're in the right place.
This psalm, I've been going through the Psalms if you've listened to more than one or two episodes, and I appreciate the time to take an excursion down just my preferential conversation pieces, the last four. But if you've been listening beyond that, I've been going through the Psalms myself, and so every third or fourth episode we try to include one of these Psalms. I'm on Psalm 88, and I will mention that I also had a Hebrew professor, an Old Testament professor here, inquire about how I would approach Psalm 88, because it is such a powerful, it's not like he didn't know how to approach it. He understands the psalm hands down better than I ever will. But it is a difficult psalm for a lot of us to appropriate for one cause or another, because it's just so discouraging. There's no, a lot of times you have psalms are built with a lot of darkness to them. They have a lot of sorrow and questioning and wondering about the reasons that God would have for not intervening and helping, and how long we've talked about how constant a motif that is in all of the Psalms. So it's not surprising when something dark shows up in a psalm, but it's a little surprising when you get to the very end of it and it is morose. It is just downright discouraging. And this is a psalm like that. The end of it is just discouraging. So we need to think through why that would be. And you can say, well, everybody needs something like that. It is sort of like that. I mean, we do need it. It is, and we're reminded at the beginning of the psalm in the superscript, a psalm of the sons of Korah, to the choir master, according to Mahalath Leonoth, a maskil of Heman the Ezrahite. So it's a psalm written by a particular psalmist that they would have recognized or known the history of, and they sing it together. It's to the choir master. This is a hymn, a special piece of music that they would use together. So just like all the Psalms, it's intended for corporate worship. There is a way we're supposed to understand this psalm as a meaningful part of an intentional worship service with God's people. How on earth? Well, it becomes really obvious and direct, just like with all of the Psalms, where we've had some questions, like, why would he say that? And how are we supposed to pray that meaningfully? Just like with all of those, this is the same way. Once you get it just in the right, in anything close to a context that makes sense of it, then there's no way to lose the sense of it. And that's what this will be. I mean, as soon as we get started, you will recognize and say, I can see why that would be. And that changes the whole picture. It makes the whole psalm not simple, not less painful, but transparent, clear in why it would be given to us. As we remember, the Psalms are always given to us first as a prayer of the Messiah, the prayer of God's people, God's Son. Israel is called God's Son. The Messiah is God's Son. And so as the Messiah prays this prayer, the people pray this prayer, and we, having been brought into the covenant through Christ, pray this prayer. That's how it comes to us. If we recognize that, then again, it's not difficult to hear this prayer in the mouth of the Messiah, to hear this prayer in the mouth of those who are suffering, which is always God's Son, the Messiah, God's Son, his people, whoever it may be in that moment. The prayer is equally meaningful. So let's do it in two steps. Let's just read through it first to get a sense of the darkness in the psalm, and then let's read through it. And I want to keep it as simple as possible. I really don't want to exaggerate the explanations here. Then let's read it and put it in a specific context where the prayer becomes obviously meaningful. And I will explain that context, but then we'll just talk through it in that way. So here's how the psalm goes. It's 18 verses, not including the superscript, 18 verses. And there are 2 verses, I'll mention them as we go through, verse 5 and verse 13, that are triplets that are longer, that have more phrases to them. And the psalm does, even after having read it and sort of I saw that structure first. I always try to look at the structure first. But then secondly, even reading the content does seem to center around those 2 verses, verses 5 and 13, which are in the middle of each of their sections. And so the psalm sort of begs to be read as sets of ideas that center around a middle verse in each of them. And so that's how we should probably take it. So you'll see how it works as I start to read it. Verse 1. O Lord, Yahweh this is, O Lord, God of my salvation, I cry out day and night before you. Let my prayer come before you. Incline your ear to my cry. For my soul is full of troubles. My life draws near to Sheol. I am counted among those who go down to the pit. I am a man who has no strength. Like one set loose among the dead, like the slain that lie in the grave, like those whom you remember no more, for they are cut off from your hand. You have put me in the depths of the pit, in the regions dark and deep. Your wrath lies heavy upon me, and you overwhelm me with all your waves. If you're wondering why that sounds familiar, I'll explain it in just a little bit. It is familiar in other places as well. Those are the first 7 verses. Verse 5, the middle verse, like one set loose among the dead, like the slain that lie in the grave, like those whom you remember no more, for they are cut off from your hand. That's verse 5, in the middle of that section. Then we start in verse 8, the second section. Verses 8 through 18, and I'll point out 13. You have caused my companions to shun me. You have made me a horror to them. I am shut in so that I cannot escape. My eye grows dim through sorrow. Every day I call upon you, O Lord. I spread out my hands to you. Do you work wonders for the dead? Do the departed rise up to praise you? Is your steadfast love declared in the grave, or your faithfulness in Abaddon? Are your wonders known in the darkness, or your righteousness in the land of forgetfulness? Verse 13, the central verse is this one. But I, O Lord, cry to you. In the morning my prayer comes before you. Verse 14 now, down to verse 18, continues the section. O Lord, why do you cast my soul away? Why do you hide your face from me? Afflicted and close to death, from my youth up I suffer your terrors. I am helpless. Your wrath has swept over me. Your dreadful assaults destroy me. They surround me like a flood all day long. They close in on me together. You have caused my beloved and my friend to shun me. My companions have become darkness. That's the end of the psalm. My companions become darkness. It is, you can hear it, a morose psalm. It just leaves us in this miserable condition. And again, sometimes we are in miserable conditions and we need the words to pray when we find ourselves in that position. So it's perfectly fine, perfectly fair. I mean, I get that. I understand that. But it's not often that we use these psalms in a way that says, okay, and now you can just stay in your misery and know you at least told God about it. Not that it'll do any good, because even your companions are darkness. You know, what's the hope that's in that? And I'm not going to leave us without hope. I'm not in the whole conversation. We won't be left without hope. But there is a specific way that I want us to understand this. And I'm not at all presuming what is in some traditions the presumption about this psalm. I don't think this at all. But I do think that tradition, that way of understanding the context of this psalm, is a good way to put it into a context where it can make sense. Because, again, we are supposed to hear these psalms in the mouth of Jesus. For us, we know the Messiah, so that's who we're talking about. When I say it's in the Messiah first that this psalm is true, then let's hear it in the mouth of Jesus. And when you put this psalm in the mouth of Jesus, there is one particular context that just makes so much sense. It's almost hard to believe he didn't say these words in that moment. And I have been there, and I have spoken these words in that place where Jesus would have spoken the words. And so, yes, it sticks with me for that reason, and again, the tradition that would have been a place where he could pray this prayer. But nobody knows for sure. We don't know which prayers he prayed when he went out on dark nights. We don't know which psalms he opened up at dawn to pray to God, but we know he did, because that's what any Jew in that context would have done, and it's what he's doing as a good Jew. So no doubt this psalm is in his heart, it's in his mind, and this context will help. You're saying, well, what context are you talking about? Okay, let me read it to you again, starting in verse 1, just down through the 4th verse, because that will introduce the context that I'm talking about. And then give you a sort of a timeline, a background, with just a few of the verses that indicate that in Jesus' life, and then leave you with thinking through what the words mean as Jesus would have been saying it in that context, so that we can understand what it might mean for us today. So we start again in verse 1, Yahweh, God of my salvation, I cry out day and night before you. And, of course, we know he did in many contexts, so I'll come back to that later. Let my prayer come before you. Incline your ear to my cry, for my soul is full of troubles, and my life draws near to Sheol. That word, we use it specifically as a substitute for hell sometimes, but it's really just the place of the dead. It includes the place of judgment when you talk about the dead being judged, but it's a generic place for all the dead, and it's specifically in contrast to the land of the living. We walk in the light up here, but in Sheol, it's where the dead are, and so there's forgetfulness and so on. And this becomes a prominent theme throughout the rest of the psalm, by the way. It is a way of thinking of death, not in terms of some metaphysical claim about what the souls are or aren't or where they actually are. It's where they aren't. They aren't where life is. And so it's just in contrast with what's going on in this world. A lot of the things that are said about the dead sound contradictory to other things in the Old Testament that talk about the dead, for instance, or in the New Testament, but they're not. They're not, because they're given to us in these Psalms especially, only in contrast to what it means to be walking among the living, which is how God blesses us. And remember how often, and we've talked about this in previous Psalms, we're reminded that God is a God of the living. That doesn't mean he's not God over the dead, but it just means the place where we receive blessings from God, we think of in the land of the living. That's what this is, and that's why Jesus is talking about life, giving life, and more abundantly, and that death is the realm of the enemy, and so on. And so here, he's drawing near to that, drawing near to Sheol, the pit, this place of the dead. And then he says it specifically in verse 4, I am counted among those who go down to the pit. And it's that word that sort of compels an understanding of this psalm in the context of Jesus' life when he would have been in a pit that I'll describe for you in a moment. And then he says, I am a man who has no strength. He is now drained of the power that's been his, not because he's God. yielded that power. It doesn't mean he didn't have it or wasn't fully God, but he yielded that power in his exercise in this world and walked as the apotheosis of man. He's doing all the things that we can't do, and he's providing in the world this abundance of wealth and healing and fertility and all the things that go with fish and bread and, all the things that happen when he's casting out demons. Here, he's not describing himself in that way, but instead as a man who has no strength. I am at the end, and I have nothing left. And so I'm calling out to God. In that moment, then I have to pause and say, so let's put this in a specific context. And again, not because I think this is the only way we're supposed to understand the psalm, but putting it in that context as we put these words into the mouth of the Messiah, which is how they get into our mouths. As we do that, I think we have to see him on that Thursday night of the Passover with the disciples, the day that he will be crucified. The day for them begins in the evening. So once he's taking the Passover, it is this day that he's going to be crucified. And so I want to give you first sort of a reminder of the timeline, and in a simple way as possible, just talk you through how this happens. So we'll do this from the Gospel of Matthew. I'll just talk you through the timeline, starting in Matthew 26. And I think you'll see, all I'm doing is just following the way Matthew tells the story. So first of all, there is the Passover meal itself, which takes place in the evening. It's an evening meal. So it says when the evening came, they gather together for the Passover. So in Matthew 26:28, as he's giving that, and I'm not going to read to you the whole Passover event. In fact, I'm only going to read to you one complete narrative, and I think it's the one that it really does. It demands attention. It begs for us to think about what's going on with Jesus during this moment. But that's the only one I'll read to you in detail. But this one little portion from the Passover meal itself, the one we remember every time we take the communion, Lord's Supper, our reminder of this supper that he took with his disciples. This is my blood of the covenant, Jesus says. This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. He's telling the disciples that he is about to face this pouring out of his life. And the drink offering, the blood that's offered in these sacrifices is poured into the ground. That's part of the picture of these sacrifices. Anyway, he says, this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. I tell you, I will not drink again of this fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom. And in that moment, he's not, I don't think there is supposed to be some heavy interpretation of eschatology, and this is, so Jesus will do this or that again at a certain time. I think he's saying to them, this is our last Passover meal together. In this world, in this kingdom, this is our last Passover meal together. I am about to die for you. And so we're not going to see each other again until we're on the other side, as we say it in our language. And I think that's what he's doing. So the evening Passover meal happens, and then remember, they leave after Judas's departure and so on. The other disciples go with Jesus, and they take a walk over to Gethsemane. They take a walk to the Mount of Olives across the way, passing the temple along the way, by the way. And so in that, in the Mount of Olives, in the Garden of Gethsemane, you remember he puts the disciples off to the side. He leaves the two behind, and then he goes a little further and offers his prayer. And in that prayer, repeatedly offers something like this. Now, in Matthew 26:39, it's exactly this. He rewords it a little bit in the second statement in Matthew 26, but I'll just give you the first one, where he says, "My Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will." And what are the disciples doing during this time? They're sleeping, during this time. He goes back to them. It's not like they remain asleep, and it's not like he curses them as a result of it. But there is this moment when you realize that he knows what's coming, and he endures through what's coming, but they're already sleeping. And then the very next thing that happens is the betrayal and the arrest. So Judas shows up with the army, and they confront him and all of that. He's arrested and taken away, and, Peter wants to resist, and he corrects them and all of that process. The betrayal and arrest happens next. And then what they do with him starts in Matthew 26:57. This section I am going to read to you, the whole section. It's just 11 verses, but it's a really important part of the story. So again, this starts with an evening meal. After the first star is already up in the sky, at least now, traditionally, that's how the Jews understand. The next day has begun when you see that first star in the evening sky. And so it's already, it's dark while they're eating the Passover meal. Then they go to Garden of Gethsemane after a hike over there. And then he has the time of prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane. And then the betrayal and arrest, and another hike back to Jerusalem, and probably past the temple and back to the other side of the city, where again, now this is what happens, starting in verse 57. Then those who had seized Jesus led him to Caiaphas the high priest, where the scribes and the elders had gathered, and Peter was following him at a distance, as far as the courtyard of the high priest, and going inside, he sat with the guards to see the end. Now, the chief priest, and there are parts of this that I've left out deliberately, and I'll mention later. I'm talking about earlier in the story. But, we realize he's the only one who was arrested and brought back to Caiaphas. So the chief priests and the whole council, they're seeking false testimony, it says in verse 59 of Matthew 26, against Jesus that they might put him to death. But they found none. Though many false witnesses came forward, at least 2 came forward and did say this. This man said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and to rebuild it in 3 days. Which, of course, we know he had said, and we understand what it was about. And so the high priest stood up and said, have you no answer to make? What is it? There's sort of a rage on the part of Caiaphas, the Annas Caiaphas, leadership among Jews in Jerusalem at the time. And so the high priest stood up and said, have you no answer to make? What is it that these men testify against you? Jesus remained silent. What is it that these men testify against you? Do you have no answer to make? And the high priest said to him, I adjure you by the living God. Tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God. And Jesus said to him, you have said so. But I tell you, from now on you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming in the clouds of heaven. Then the high priest tore his robes, and he said, he has uttered blasphemy. What further witnesses do we even need? You've heard his blasphemy. What is your judgment? They answered, he deserves death. Then they spit in his face, and they struck him, and some slapped him, saying, prophesy to us, you Christ. Who is it that struck you? All of this is going on because they have now pronounced a judgment against him. But they can't execute the judgment without the Romans' approval. It can't look like a mob scene. They have to maintain, the Pax Romana. So they have to have approval of the Roman government to do anything else. So here, late at night, it doesn't have to be 2 a.m, but it might be. I don't know how long it takes to do all of this with the multitudes that were involved, the crowd that came to arrest Jesus and bring him back. So I don't know exactly what the timeline looks like, but I know this. It's nighttime when they take him before Caiaphas, and they've got to figure out what they're going to do for the rest of the night. Part of it is in mocking and excoriating Jesus for all the things that he has done. I don't know how long that part of the process goes on. What I do know is that the way Matthew tells us the story, we take in this way. So while Jesus is inside being castigated by the high priest class of people who are there, Peter is outside practicing a betrayal, right? So Peter's betrayal is potentially, as we hear it normally, meanwhile, outside. What? And so I'm not positive that's what we should say about it. I'll explain in just a second. But here's what happens with Peter outside. Peter is confronted by one person after another and, denies knowing Christ one time after another. And I think we're supposed to take this as the progression of the narrative forward, for the reason that's most obvious, that when the betrayal is done with, what it says is this at the end of Matthew 26 in verse 74. It says, "Then he began to invoke a curse on himself." This is when he's denying Christ so strongly, and the wording is it's just so sad, so miserable. But it's the very end of his own denial, betrayal. So it says he began to invoke a curse on himself and to swear, "I do not know the man." And immediately the rooster crowed. Now, we only think to ourselves normally, oh, well, yeah, that proves that Christ was right. Sure enough, the rooster crowed right after Peter betrayed him 3 times. And that's a great point. I mean, that's obviously one of the things that Matthew wants us to recognize, along with every other author. But the other thing it means is it's now dawn. The roosters are crowing. That was the point of Jesus saying it. Before dawn comes, this is what you're going to do to me. You're going to betray me, which means I think the way we're supposed to read the story is not while Jesus is having these things happen to him inside, Peter is doing this outside, but rather, here's what happened to Jesus inside, and now they're finished with that. They're mocking him on the way to whatever they're going to do with him, which is predictably to put him down into the cistern where you would store people. It's the pit, the jail, the cell where you would keep people. It's the same place they would have kept the disciples when they start preaching about Jesus and they get arrested until they can be brought before the council and the determination made about what to do with them. They need to figure out what to do with Jesus until they're going to take him away to Pilate the governor. And so the thing that happens while Jesus is in the pit is his friend outside completely betraying him. "I do not know the man." And immediately the rooster crowed. And what would Jesus be doing while he's in this pit? And so the idea that Jesus is kept in Caiaphas's place through the night has come to be sort of the traditional understanding of where this psalm would have most certainly emerged as an inevitable prayer of Jesus, a psalm from a pit where your friends are betraying you. Exactly what's happening with Jesus. So the beginning of Matthew 27, the very next verse is that when morning came. So now Peter has betrayed him, the rooster has crowed. When morning came, all the chief priests and the elders of the people took counsel against Jesus to put him to death. So they bound him so that he's still there with them. That's where he would be, in the pit. So now they take him out, and they bound him, and they led him away, and they delivered him over to Pilate, the governor. So you can see why the context that's given to this is of Jesus praying this prayer in the pit, but below Caiaphas's house, on the day that he's going to be crucified for the people who are standing outside betraying him in the moment. And so it goes on in verse 5 in the psalm, and you can just, the words make sense in the prayer in the mouth of a Messiah who's praying for his people just as he's praying for himself, for God to remember them, for God to remember him, while they're betraying him. Like one, it says in verse 5, set loose among the dead like the slain that lie in the grave, like those whom you remember no more because they're cut off from your hand. In any story you've ever read, in any movie you've ever watched, in any scene that's gotten you to this point, this is the moment of greatest despair, of complete and utter loss. There is nothing good left in this moment. It is hopeless, dark, miserable. And so it goes on to say in verse 6, you have put me in the depths of the pit, in the regions dark and deep. Your wrath lies heavy upon me, and you overwhelm me with all your waves. The reason that's familiar to you is, because of the quotation of it as a psalm from Jonah. Is prayer in the sea, what he prays in the belly of the whale. For you remember in chapter 2, it's all his prayer from the belly of the whale, this prayer from the pit, which tells you this is not new to Jesus. There is a context for this psalm that goes with every messianic figure. And in Jonah being a messianic figure, you can think to yourself, he's not a great Messiah. None of them are perfect Messiahs. They all have
faults to them except Jesus. That's the point. When we finally get to the Messiah, he's the only one who actually lives it all the way through. But you remember Jonah praying it in Jonah 2. In fact, I'll read it to you in a second. What I really want to point out is that this is not an exception for Jesus to be lowered into the pit and for him to offer the words of a prayer like this up to the Father that are basically without hope because he's in a pit. Every messianic figure has an experience like this. And if you think through the Joseph being thrown into a pit and left for dead before he's finally drawn out so that God can use him to redeem the very people that threw him into the pit. In the same way that Daniel is thrown into a pit and left there to be devoured by lions, or Jonah having been thrown into the whale, and using this language of the pit, you cast me into the deep, into the heart of the seas, and the flood surrounded me. All your waves and your billows passed over me. That's the quotation from this psalm. Or Jeremiah, when he makes his announcements that Jerusalem's going to fall at Babylon's hands. I mean, he sounds like a traitor, a betrayer. So they throw him into a pit. A king is finally merciful, takes him out. But the enemies come again and they say, no, he's got to go into the pit. He's discouraging everyone. They throw him back into the pit. It says in Jeremiah 38:6. So they took Jeremiah and cast him into the cistern. And you see how they used a cistern as the pit, the place to keep a prisoner who couldn't escape. You lower him down by ropes and there's no way out. You're just trapped. And so they took Jeremiah and they cast him into the cistern of Malchiah, the king's son, which was in the court of the guard, letting Jeremiah down by ropes, and there was no water in the cistern, but only mud, and Jeremiah sank in the mud. You could hear Jeremiah praying exactly the same words of this psalm, and it making perfect sense. He's being betrayed by everyone, and he's simply there to represent the truth of God's word to them. You can understand why this makes sense. Not that we would say, we know that Jesus opened Psalm 88 and read it. First of all, he would have it memorized just like everybody else would in their day. But secondly, it just makes sense to understand it in that context for us now to understand how this psalm can relate to us when we're going through a similar thing. And so I want to read the second half of the psalm, verses 8 through 18, with verse 13 as the center of it, in the context of Jesus and us understanding Jesus having said the words. And, I will say, I'm shaped by my experience of this, having been in Israel and taken to the place that may have been Caiaphas's house and to the cistern underneath it where prisoners would have been kept, and likely where Jesus was kept. It's very possible that that's the place where all of this transpired. And for us to stand in that cistern surrounding the space where Jesus would have been, and to quote Psalm 88, that experience does shape me. So that affects it. But again, I'm not saying that's how it had to happen, but understanding the psalm in that context, doesn't it give you a way to understand how to read this psalm and make sense of it? And so in verse 8, the prayer continues of this one who's in a dark, lonely, dank, miserable place with his friends having betrayed him. He says, you have caused my companions to shun me. You have made me a horror to them. I'm shut in so that I cannot escape. My eye grows dim through sorrow every day. I call upon you, O Lord. I spread out my hands to you. Do you work wonders for the dead? Do the departed rise up to praise you? This is not a statement denying the resurrection. It's not one affirming the resurrection for sure, but it's not denying the resurrection. The whole point of it is to say, look, the place where I'm able to do things for you is here among the living. So why am I in this place where there are no living? Why am I in the place where there's only death? Is this what you desire? I thought I could serve you. You could hear Jeremiah saying the same words in verse 11. Is your steadfast love declared in the grave, or your faithfulness in a place of destruction, Abaddon? Are your wonders known in the darkness, or your righteousness in the land of forgetfulness? By the way, this is the point, that in these moments, what we've seen in Jesus' betrayal and arrest, remember that when he's arrested, it says in Matthew 26, then all the disciples forsook him and fled. There's no one there but him. He's completely alone. And so sort of the way this wording I think should be taken is, here's the land of the living. It makes perfect sense for me to communicate your message to the living, and you put me in the place of the dead. I'm in the belly of the earth. There is no one for me to communicate with. You may say to yourself, and I've been stuck with this in the past as well, but I think we have to work past this in some ways. You may say to yourself, but that complaint doesn't make sense for Jesus. He's here to die. He was born for the purpose of dying. The land of living for him was a land that was inevitably going to death. But that's true for all of us. All of us come into this world knowing that we're going to die. It doesn't change the value or meaning of the life that we have here. Jesus experiences that exactly the same way we do. That's the point. That truth doesn't make his life different from ours. It makes us understand why this prayer makes so much sense to him. If all you're doing is saying, yes, Lord, I'll do whatever you want, and then you speak what the Lord wants you to speak, and the result is you get put in a place where you cannot speak, and no one can hear you, and there is no prospect for a future whatsoever. You lose completely. Then this prayer makes perfect sense, doesn't it? Lord, why are you doing this? I was saying what you wanted me to say. I mean, are people going to hear me here in the land of destruction, the place of death, the place where no one lives? That doesn't make sense. And so that's what he's crying out with. But he says this in offering hope. And I will repeat this at the end because, as I said, this central verse, verse 13, in the second half of the psalm, sort of sets what the whole psalm is about, or what this whole half of the psalm is about. But we have to put it in the right order. So I want to explain it at the end so we can make sense of it. So in the right order, though, in verse 13, right in the middle, he says, yet I, O Lord, I cry to you, and in the morning my prayer comes before you. In the morning, my prayer comes before you. Now we start in verse 14. So you can hear, this is night. Everything is wrong. Everything is darkness. And it's not a solution. Oh, but in the morning, everything will be okay. In the morning, he's going to go to the cross. In the morning, he's going to go to the thing he was just praying with the Father about, to say, let this cup pass from me. If there is any way possible, please let this cup pass away from me. That's what's coming in the morning. It's not a glib, everything will be all right in the morning. It's not that. There are psalms that offer something, it's not glib, obviously, but there are psalms that offer that kind of hope. Oh, there's darkness the night, but joy comes in the morning. Hallelujah. This is not that. It's not that simple. But we'll get back to it in just a moment in verse 13. So in verse 14, he continues, but, oh, Lord, why do you cast my soul away? Why are you hiding your face from me? This is going to extend itself to the Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, right? So, oh Lord, why are you casting my soul away? Why are you hiding your face from me? Afflicted and close to death from my youth up, I suffer your terrors. I'm helpless. I've depended on you. Your wrath has swept over me. Your dreadful assaults have destroyed me. And he is destroyed. He is in a muddy pit with no hope. They surround me like a flood all day long. They close in on me together. You've caused my beloved, and here, we're reading the words of one who's praying this, while outside his friend is saying, I do not know the man. And immediately the rooster crowed. That event is going on outside, while Jesus is saying, you have caused my beloved and my friend to shun me. My companions have become darkness. In all of that, in verse 14, I mentioned, when he says, why are you casting my soul away? And you could say, why would he say that? He's fulfilling the Father's will. This is Jesus. This is the same thing he's going to do while he's on the cross. My God, why have you forsaken me? That from Psalm 22. Now in Psalm 88, it makes sense that he would say the same words in the pit, where that there's nowhere to go from here but to the crucifixion, which is following. So what does verse 13, what do you do with this other than just say, oh, okay, we're going to have miserable times. And, in miserable times, I guess we just commiserate with God. We can. And we have words to commiserate with God. We have words to bring our misery before God and say, God, you gave me the words to share with you. This is how I really feel right now. Here's where I am. That would be enough. But that verse 13 does have something in it. But I, O Lord, cry to you, and in the morning my prayer comes before you. I'm not backing it up like to say, oh yeah, I know Peter betrayed me, but it's okay. Morning's coming and Peter's going to come back around and everything will be all right. It's not that simple. As time is continuing inside and Jesus is going through what he's going through in the pit, having been lowered into it after having been mocked and scourged and all those things that Caiaphas is doing with him, as well as what he's going to experience after Pilate is doing things with him. And all the things that are happening inside that we're not given the details about. What's happening outside, Peter is absolutely betraying him, stacking it up until the rooster crows and Peter has denied everything. In that context, the betrayal is absolute. The darkness is absolute. In that context, now it is morning. So they're binding him and they're leading him away, Matthew 27:1. They're binding him, they're leading him away. They're going to give him to Pilate so that they can take him away and finally do with him what they want, which is not just a stoning, but a crucifixion, so he can be cursed by God. All as miserable and dark as it can possibly be in that context. The psalm in that context conveys perfectly the utter totality of Jesus' destruction, forsaken by friends, owned by his opponents, anticipating crucifixion. So the psalm, what, is ending with, oh, but God hears, so it's okay. No, it's not that simple, not nearly that simple. But it does say this: when your friends are betraying you, and when the cross is still in front of you, that moment, that's not night. That's the morning. It's not the end. In the morning, your prayer comes before the Father. That our lamentations, our how long, O Lord, our longing desire for something different than this world is always met by a psalm that says, even at its darkest, this is not the end. It is the time when, while you're being betrayed and while it is dark, your prayer is coming up before the Father. Faith doesn't mean things are going to get better. Faith means even when things are getting worse, our prayers are still wafting up before the Father's holy place. That's how they're described in the Revelation when destruction is rampaging through the world. Our prayers are still wafting up before the Father's holy place. So what is it that we believe when we leave a psalm like this? I believe that in the morning, my prayer comes before the Father. I don't like what's going on. I don't know what the Father will do with my prayer. But I believe in the Father. And that's it. To be able to say simply, God, I believe in you.
Thanks for joining us for Coffee with Creamer. Your cup of coffee may be finished, but we are not. Come back next week for a refill as we sit down to examine a new set of ideas and cultural issues. Don't miss an episode. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts or visit our website at barrycreamer.com. Until next time, keep your mug hot and your mind sharp.